All right, for those of you who are joining us from home, what we're going to go over real quick today is just kind of a introduction to basic human inheritance. This is really a front load for your assessment that you're going to start taking on Thursday and Friday, which is going to be over human genetics. And so what I wanted to do today is just kind of introduce you to some of the disorders you're going to see on the assessment, what they are, how they're inherited, so that when you see it, it's not the first time that you're seeing it. So I'm going to work you through the PowerPoint really quick, and then we'll go from there. There you go. Okay. So what we're going to look at is how traits are inherited either as a recessive trait or as a dominant trait or as what we call a sex-linked trait, which is where the trait is carried on a sex chromosome, usually the X chromosome, actually. Okay, I'm back. So what we're going to look at first is how traits are inherited as a recessive trait. So if we look right here on our so a person with a recessive allele disorder needs to have two alleles to inherit disease, just like we've talked about. If you have something that's recessive, you have to inherit two alleles for the trait, one from each parent, which means that each of your parents needs to give you a recessive allele. So people with homozygous recessive genotypes will be affected by this disorder. And if we look at this Punnett square right here, you notice where we're talking about the heterozygous, you'll notice that there is a certain term underneath them called a carrier. And a carrier is just somebody who carries the allele, but they don't exhibit symptoms of the disorder. So they carry the recessive allele, but they also have a dominant allele, which means that they don't have the disorder, but they still carry that gene and can pass it on to offspring. So a couple that we're going to look at are things like albinism. Okay, albinism is inherited as a recessive trait. In humans, it's marked by a complete lack of pigmentation in the skin, in the hair, in the eyes. People with albinism are very susceptible to very bright light. It can cause headaches very easily. And UV radiation is a big problem for them because they don't have melanin in their skin that provides a little bit of a natural barrier. So even people who are very, very pale, like me and my Scandinavian heritage, still have a little bit of melanin in our skins that gives us that teeny tiny bit of it. If you look at somebody who has albinism, they have a little bit of a tinge to their skin, but that's because they still have blood underneath there that's going to give them a little bit of a pinkish glow. So if we were to look at a Punnett square with albinism, our problem says Craig and Nina are married and have 4 children. Both Craig and Nina have brown hair and eyes as well as light to medium skin. However, 2 of their 4 children have albinism. So we're going to use A for albinism in our Punnett square. So we want to know, what is Craig's genotype? Well, if they have kids who have albinism, and albinism is recessive, it means that both kids are going to have little a, little a, so bad. So in order for them to get little a, what genotypes do their parents need to have? And, well, here's one. It's going to have a dominant and recessive because they have to have a recessive. Again, a dominant recessive. And our Punnett square looks like this. So Craig's genotype would be big A, little a. Nina's genotype would be big A, little a, because they both have to contribute a recessive allele so that their kids can actually inherit that and have albinism. So question number 3 says, what is the probability that their next child will also have albinism? Well, if we look at the Punnett square, we see that it's 25%. Now, if I were to ask where the chances that their next child would not have albinism, that jumps up to 75% because this one right here, homozygous dominant, and the 2 heterozygous would all 3 not have albinism. Heterozygous big A, little a would be a carrier of albinism, so they could pass that trait on. but they will not exhibit the symptoms of the disorder. Cystic fibrosis is another disorder that's carried on a recessive allele. It's 1 in 2,000 births, and what happens with cystic fibrosis is there's a very thick buildup of sticky, yucky mucus in the lungs, and it can also spread to the liver and the pancreas. Well, if it gets to the liver, it cuts down on your body's ability to filter out toxins. If it gets into the pancreas, it causes your body to lose the ability to produce insulin. And in the lungs, it cuts down on your body's ability to bring in oxygen. Now, the huge downside to cystic fibrosis is, number one, you're born with it. Number two, there's no cure for it. There's only treatment. And number three, life expectancy is only in the mid-30s. So somebody who's your age with cystic fibrosis would already be considered middle age because they don't usually live past 40. So if we look at a Punnett square with a couple who carries, both of them are carriers for this trait, and they already have 2 children with it. So question number 1 says, what would be the genotypes of the parents? Well, if they're carriers, automatically we know they're heterozygous because they have to be able to carry that recessive allele but not exhibit symptoms of the disorder. So both parents would be carriers, and then their offspring's Punnett square would look like this. So question 2 says, what would be the genotype for their children with CF? Well, it'd be homozygous recessive. What's the probability that their next child will have cystic fibrosis? Again, it's the same genotype, but it's only 25%. The percentage of not having cystic fibrosis would be 75%, and then 50% of that would be possibly being a carrier. So each child would have a 25% chance of being normal, a 50% chance of being a carrier, and a 25% chance of developing cystic fibrosis. Another one that is inherited through recessive alleles is Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs disease is very prevalent in people from Jewish ancestry, especially what's called the Ashkenazi Jews. And what happens with that is there are communities where this disease pops up, and because they're isolated communities, people within the communities keep marrying each other, and so that disease becomes very heavily prevalent in that community because they're not bringing in new genes. It's just the same genes that keep getting recycled. So people who have Jewish ancestry tend to actually have a higher chance of carrying the allele or the gene for Tay-Sachs. Now, Tay-Sachs is it's a horrible disease. When children are born with it, what happens is they're missing an enzyme or a chemical in their brain that breaks down fat. And as that fat builds up inside their brain, it can cause severe mental deficiencies. You would have a toddler who has the mental capacity of a newborn. It doesn't get much further than that. Eventually, they lose the ability to see, the ability to hear, they become paralyzed, they can't respond to their surroundings. So you have this child who could be 3 years old and still be just like a newborn. And there's nothing that can get them past that. And the life expectancy of a child with Tay-Sachs disease is only about 3 years. So this is one that we would definitely look into something with genetic counseling. And you can look at your family history and your partner's family history and say, all right, is this in here? And is this something that we want to take a risk of possibly passing on? Whereas, if it's like cystic fibrosis here and you have a 75% chance of not passing it on, is that, a good enough ratio, 75%, that's 3 out of 4. But then there's some people say, but it's also 25% chance that they will. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You have to kind of figure out which way do you feel about it. Our second type of inheritance we look at is dominant inheritance. And what we've seen so far is in order to exhibit a dominant trait, you only have to have 1 allele for the dominant. You could have 2, but you only need 1. But where it diverges in humans is that if we have somebody who's homozygous dominant for a dominant allele, that is usually fatal. For some reason, 2 dominant alleles for certain traits just aren't compatible with life. One example of this is achondroplasia, which is a type of dwarfism. In achondroplasia, big A, or homozygous dominance results in stillbirth or death within the first couple of months of life. There's something about just the 2 dominant alleles that just doesn't work. With achondroplasia or dwarfism, somebody who is someone who's heterozygous would have achondroplasia. They would be what we would call a dwarf. And then somebody who's homozygous recessive would have what's called normal height. So if we're looking at this, let's skip the video here. So here we have achondroplasia. I have two actors that I'm showing that have the disorder. You have Peter Dinklage right here, who is been in quite a few things recently. He's in Game of Thrones, playing Tyrion Lannister. He was in Elf, which we just watched the other night with my kiddos. He was in Pixels, which was one of my son's favorite movies. He does a lot of voice acting. Right here is Warwick Davis, who was kind of my generation's Peter Dinklage. He was in movies like Star Wars and Harry Potter, and one of my favorites from the 80s is Willow. Here we have a family of dwarfs from Romania who actually survived the Holocaust because they had achondroplasia. This was a trait that actually kept them alive because there was a doctor at a concentration camp who thought they were just the coolest thing ever. So he actually kept them alive through the Holocaust, you know, not really on purpose, but they survived because of the disorder that they had. And if we look at people who have achondroplasia, the average male is about 4 foot 4 inches tall. Average female is about 4'1". And where the discrepancy comes is if you look at somebody with achondroplasia and somebody who has normal height, their torso is going to be the same. But where we see the difference is in the long bones. So the long bones of your arm, the long bones of your leg, the long bones of your fingers and toes, all have stunted growth. There's also some facial features that you can see they're similar. So if we look at the Ovitz family here, we look at Warwick Davis, and we look at Peter Dinklage, and we look at this family right here, you can see some similarities facially that goes hand in hand with achondroplasia. Now, if we were to put this in a Punnett square, our question says, what would be the chance of having a child with achondroplasia if one parent has the disorder? Well, to have achondroplasia, you can't have two dominants because that's fatal. So somebody with achondroplasia is going to have one dominant and one recessive, and that recessive just kind of mellows out the dominant a little bit. And someone with normal height would be homozygous recessive because the dominant is what causes the achondroplasia trait. So our Punnett square would look like this, and we want to know what would the chance of having a child with achondroplasia be. Well, it's anybody who has a dominant allele, so it would be 50%. So there's our two that have dominant alleles. The other two would be, the other 50% would be normal height. Huntington's disease is a disease where you can live your life up until your mid-30s perfectly normal. Nothing's wrong. And then eventually something gets triggered in your body and your brain starts to degenerate. And as your brain degenerates, it causes the way your brain connects with your muscles to be interrupted. And Huntington's disease causes severe muscle jerks, uncontrollable muscle movement, loss of the ability to swallow, loss of the ability to talk, you lose control of your bowels. And what happens with Huntington's disease is when you start showing symptoms, it decreases your lifespan. And from the time of onset of the symptoms, you have about 10 to 20 years. But in that 10 to 20 years, you are not in control of your body whatsoever. Your brain is not communicating with your limbs, and there's just all kinds of muscle control issues, and there's nothing that really can stop it. If you have a parent who has Huntington's disease, you have a 50-50 chance of inheriting it, just like with achondroplasia here. Imagine the A's as H's with Huntington's disease, and two of those would have a dominant associated with them. So you have a 50-50 chance of passing that on to offspring. I'm just giving you a short version of this. Sex-linked traits, this is not something that I'm going to assess you on, but it's something that's just kind of cool because of the way it works. And a sex-linked trait doesn't matter if it's dominant or recessive, it matters which sex chromosome it's on. It's usually always carried on the X chromosome. Now, what this means is it doesn't, with dominant recessive traits, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you have an equal opportunity chance of getting it. However, with the sex-linked trait, it absolutely matters if you're male or female because it's carried on the X chromosome. And there is a statistically higher percentage of males who contract sex-linked traits because females have 2 X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y. Now, with a female, okay, if the trait is recessive or dominant, it doesn't matter, okay? But say this is a recessive linked trait, for a female, she can have 2 X chromosomes. And she could have one that has a dominant allele for that too, which would cancel out the recessive. In a male, however, it doesn't matter if it's dominant or recessive. If they inherit one copy of that, they will have the disorder because they don't have that extra X chromosome and anything to cancel it out. Now, the X chromosome has about 900 genes on it. The Y chromosome has 50. So if mom is what we call a carrier, which means that she has the recessive allele but also the dominant, there's a 50-50 chance that her son would have the trait. If dad has the trait, there's also a 50-50 chance that their son would have it. So one of the most common ones you see is color blindness. It affects 1 in 12 males, but 1 in 200 females, because in order for a female to contract color blindness, she has to have a father who is colorblind and a mother who is a carrier, so that both dad and mom could contribute a recessive allele for her to inherit. Usually the odds of that are pretty slim. The two major types of colorblindness that we see is blue-yellow colorblind, where you can see here, where blues kind of appear as a teal, greens appear as a gray, and they don't see yellow. Red-green colorblindness, you can see where red and green are kind of the same color. Yellow's kind of blend in there as well. Red-green colorblindness is the most common type. And I will put a video down below this that you can watch that'll show you some examples of how it appears to somebody who has colorblindness. It shows you 3 different colorblindnesses, and you can see what it looks like. I'm not gonna have you watch that. I'll have you put it down below. So these are just colorblind tests that you usually get in elementary school. I can remember pulled out of classes to test these every year. Now, I am never going to ask you guys to do an excellent Punnett square because it's not something that we cover, it's not something we need to cover, but I just think these are kind of cool. So this is an example of how it would work. And it says that Jeff and Emily are married and expecting their first child. Jeff has normal vision and so does Emily, but she is a carrier for colorblindness. They find out that they will be having twins, 1 boy and 1 girl. So they want to know, what is the probability that their son will be colorblind? I already gave you the answer. So let's figure out where that answer comes from. So this is Emily's genotype, okay? But Emily is a carrier, which means that the little b right here is the colorblindness gene. So that's recessive, and then she has the dominant gene that kind of cancels it out. So she's just a carrier, she doesn't exhibit it. Jeff has the dominant allele for it, but he doesn't have the recessive, so he does not exhibit it either. So as we work through the Punnett square, we have a female right here who has 2 dominant alleles, which means she would not have any kind of color blindness. We have a female right here who has a dominant and a recessive, so she would be a carrier. We have a son down here who has the dominant trait, which means he would not be colorblind. And then the son right here has a recessive allele, which means that he would be colorblind. So probability that their son would be colorblind, well, these are the only 2 we have that would be male, and only one of those would be colorblind, so we have a 50-50 chance. The probability that their daughter would be colorblind is 0%, because each one has a dominant allele there. Carrier would be 50% right here. Normal vision would be 50% right here. So with that, when you go to take your assessment, there is some background information in Canvas that you will need. So follow the link in tomorrow's or on Thursday's Canvas page. It's going to say access information here, and then you'll have a separate link for your assessment. The information on the Canvas pages will help you answer the questions. As soon as you're finished with it, you're done for the weekend, and then come back on Monday for our second assessment. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to help. Good luck with it. See you guys later.